Hi there. In this lecture, we're going to be going over some really good advice, tips, strategies, and advice that cover all three parts of the IELTS speaking test. You're going to hear some great advice from some examiners, former examiners on the IELTS, and they're going to give you some really, really good advice I'm going to share with you. And then also you're going to get my expert advice on the speaking section. So let's go ahead and move forward. Make sure that you're taking notes, and let's go ahead and really take this in because I want you guys to do a great job on the IELTS speaking section. And the key to doing that is being able to master and apply this advice you're going to get in this lecture. So, part one is known to be pretty easy. It's basically a warm-up. But I would say that you have to really do well in part number one. A lot of students mess up because they just start off very slowly. And that's a big mistake. You want to be able to start off in part number one and do well right away. Part number two, from the different examiners that I've talked to over the years, is where they really get a chance to see how good you can speak, how well you can speak. Part number two is really the score determiner. So if you want to do well on the speaking section, if you want to move up into that band 8, band 9 section or realm according to the rubric, do great at part two. Part two impresses them. Part number three, they're making their final decision. You know, if you do a great job on part number three, that might give you that little bit of extra boost to push you where you need to be able to go. Now, here's some more just, again, basic general advice about the different sections. In part number one, what you want to do, give a direct answer, extend it, and then explain. Then stop, smile, show the examiner that you're ready to move on to the next question. Don't just ramble on and on and on and on, and where the examiner has to stop you every single time. In part number two, one of the best ways to think about it is that you're telling a story, right? Tell a story. And keep in mind, the truth does not matter. They're grading you on how you say something, not what you say. In part number three, some really good advice. Just practice writing out your answers. Write out your answers, and when you write out your answers, include some of the natural fluency markers when you're doing your writing. In addition, to do well on part number three, practice with a partner. Practice being able to give those really extended answers in part number three. The questions in part one and part three are similar, except in part three, the questions are longer and they have more complex vocabulary. So in part number three, you're expected to answer directly, extend your answer again, and then maybe explain or give an alternative scenario to extend that answer. They really are looking for you to give deep, well thought out answers. Again, it's not about the ideas. You have to be within the context of the question, but it's all about how you say it. Now, let's go ahead and move on and talk about a few more things that could be helpful to you during the IELTS speaking section. Sometimes students ask me, is it okay to ask them to repeat a question? Yes, it's okay. But you cannot do that 4 and 5 times. Can you please repeat that? Could you please say that question again for me? If you're always doing that, it's going to seem like you don't understand English very well. If you do it once or twice, that's okay. I mentioned earlier about speaking spontaneously. You know, the graders are not going to be impressed. They are going to be very impressed if you're using speech that shows automaticity, right? That shows that you can speak spontaneously. Speaking spontaneously sounds more natural. I can always tell when a student is really memorizing or giving a memorized answer. Now, at the top here, you see that I have something about speaking with abstract nouns and ideas. Using abstract nouns and ideas is a really good way to show the grader that you have very strong vocabulary. There's a great video on this, and I mentioned it at the top, that talks about abstract nouns and ideas. First impressions. Examiners are human beings, which means that they can be impressed. And so your first impression is really important. If you really start off just with a strong start, that's going to stay with the examiner throughout the rest of your speaking test. And finally, be emotional in your speaking. Native speakers have an emotional content when they're speaking. A lot of times when I'm listening to a non-native speaker, they don't have that emotional content, and it doesn't sound natural, and that actually ends up with a lower score. A few more things to mention. I mentioned number one earlier about how, not what. Mimic native speakers. When you're listening to me during this section of the course, it's okay for you to stop, back up, listen to what I said, and repeat how I said it. Mimicking native speakers is a great way to really improve your pronunciation. Also, this third one here, in terms of speak with punctuation. Let me explain that. What that means to speak with punctuation is when you're speaking, there are periods, there are commas, there are semicolons, right? Speak with punctuation. A lot of students mess up because they just run through their sentences. They literally just run through their sentences. No punctuation at all. That equals a lower score. And finally, use a speech-to-text program. These are great because the program actually writes out what you're saying, and it gives you an opportunity to really look back at that information and look for areas where you can really improve. Moving on, practice like the real exam. Practice like the real exam. If you just sit in your room by yourself and answer questions to yourself, you're not doing real practice. You're not practicing like the exam. This next one, in terms of speaking English, let me be clear about what I'm talking. Let me explain myself better when I'm talking about speak English. If your exam is coming up in 2 to 3 weeks, what you really need to do is just speak English all the way up to the date of your exam, when it's possible. Now, of course, if you have people in your family that don't speak English, you're not going to be able to really do that. But the more that you're speaking English, the better your fluency is going to be, and also your pronunciation. So speak English. Structure your responses. This kind of goes in line with what I said in terms of speaking with punctuation. You want to give a structured response, structured answers. Don't just ramble and babble on because you're going to lose coherence. And finally, learn to recover. What I mean by learn to recover is everybody messes up sometimes. Everybody does. Even when I'm practicing, I might mess up. But what you have to be able to do is you have to recover quickly. If you think about how you just messed up, you're going to mess up on the next question. Be confident, prepare, speak naturally, and record and transcribe. In terms of these four, I'm going to really talk a little bit about being confident, because there's nowhere on the rubric where it says, oh, he gets a better score for being confident. But very often, like I said, the examiners are human beings. And there's really nothing more impressive than a confident speaker. Sometimes when you're a confident speaker, it sometimes helps hide some of those mistakes that you make. So really try to be confident when you're speaking. Now, here are some great tips on what not to do. Flat intonation. Flat intonation will always lead to a lower score. So, what I mean by that is this. I like music because music has always been a part of my life, and I don't know what I would do if I could not listen to music every day. Now, some of you may hear that and say, okay, well, that's okay. Well, it's very flat. There was no intonation. There was no rising and falling. Native speakers have intonation. If you're flat, you're going to really hurt your score. Big words. Very often, I'll hear students use words that I would never use. Like, these are really just big words that somebody looked up in a dictionary and said, I'm going to use this word. And very often what ends up happening is they use the word out of context or they use it inappropriately. Confusing grammar. On the exam, use the grammar that you have mastered. All right? Of course, saying nothing is going to damage your score. You can't just sit there silently. Don't give any memorized answers. Don't give any memorized answers. Okay? We can always tell when you're giving a memorized answer. Right? There's training. All examiners have training. Right? So giving a memorized answer, they will always be able to. I hear these memorized answers really in the beginning of part number 1. Like when I ask somebody, what's your name? And they give me some really just canned, prepared answer. And I know it's something that's already prepared, and so I just immediately discount it. Don't even count it. It doesn't count towards your score. Okay? Don't parrot. Don't be a parrot. What I mean by that in terms of parroting means like repeating the question words. Don't do that. And don't rely on the examiner. Don't look for help, right? They're going to let you make mistakes. They're not going to help you. Also, don't do this. And I've talked to examiners. They don't like this. They don't like when you ask their opinion. When you finish the exam, how do you think I did? How did I do? They don't like that. Don't do that. I'm telling you, they don't like it. So don't ask them, how did you do? Thank them for their time. Get up and go. Okay? Be professional. But don't sit there and ask them, how do you think I did? They don't like it. Now, here's some great advice. This advice is directly from examiners. I interviewed some examiners, and I really asked them, give me your advice to students that are taking the IELTS speaking section of the test. And number 1, they said, stay on topic. Right? Stay on topic. They love when you stay within the context of the question. When I hear students speaking, some of the biggest mistakes that I hear is when they ask you a question and you just ramble on outside of the context of the question. You're hurting yourself. So don't do it. Repetition. Please don't just keep saying, actually, I really don't like music very much. Actually, the weather in my country never changes. Actually, I love going to street markets. Using idioms and figures of speech, if they're properly used, it impresses them a lot, right? You have to know about your time management. Know when to stop talking. Just keep your eyes and keep good eye contact with the examiner, because you can tell in their body language that they're getting ready to ask you a new question. And that means when you start seeing them getting ready to ask you a new question, it's time for you to wrap it up. Answering in no. You can't just answer no, right? You cannot just answer no. You can't say no and then stop. You're going to get a 4.5 or 5, maybe even a 4. Don't use any slang, right? From what I've been told by the examiners that I interviewed, do not use slang. And what we're talking about there is street slang. Now, complex sentences, every once in a while, they like to see that you can use the different sentence forms. Complex, compound, those types of sentences. Okay, now let's move into some more examiner advice. Again, this is directly from the examiners. Part number 3 is a discussion. Be mindful and don't launch into a long interrupted speech. Keep in mind in part number 3, they're saying they can stop you, jump in, ask you a question because this is a discussion. In part number 2, again, this is something they all said when I interviewed them. Part number 2 is when I start thinking about the scores. In terms of your grammar, some examiners are human beings. Some of them really care about grammar. And if you have really, really bad grammar, it's going to keep you in the range of a 5 to 6. And as I said, don't ask them how well you did at the end of a test. Here's some answers to some general questions that students have asked me over the years. What if I don't understand the question? Well, you're probably in a little bit of trouble if you don't understand the question, right? Now, you can, of course, ask the grader, well, what do you mean by that? You can do that more in part number 3. In part number 1, they really don't like it if you're asking about what do you mean by that? Because really, part number 1 questions, if you're taking the IELTS exam, you should know part number 1 questions. If you don't understand a part number 1 question, then I'm going to really wonder if you really should be doing the IELTS exam right now at this time. But if you don't understand it, really kind of look at the topic of the question and try to give some answer regarding the topic of the question. You're going to be hurt a little bit because you didn't answer the question specifically, but that's the best advice I can give you. What template phrases can I use to score high? There are no template phrases you can use, okay? Examiners recognize templates. They recognize it. It sounds prepared. And they don't like it. I'm telling you, they do not like it. What if I forget how to pronounce a word? Well, if you don't use it, number 1. If you don't know how to pronounce a word properly, don't use it. Don't say it, okay? You can always just describe the word, or use a simpler word, or use a synonym of the word. How should I start my answer? Well, I mean, that's a really difficult question to answer in terms of how should I start my answer. Really, the best advice I can say is paraphrase the question, right? Paraphrase the question. Be direct. Be very direct. Paraphrase the question, be very direct, explain. How can I know the correct answer? There is no correct answer, right? If there can be 1,000 different answers to a question. There is no correct answer. So if you're focusing on what's the correct answer, you're focusing on the wrong thing. Now, let's talk about something that's very serious. And what I'm talking about here is overcoming test anxiety. Test anxiety, right? A lot of students, they say, oh, I'm so nervous. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm so nervous. And when you have that kind of anxiety going into an exam, you're just you're just really setting yourself up for disaster. These are here on this page. This is just some general advice. One that I really like a lot: study in similar places. If possible, go to a similar place as the testing center and practice sometimes studying in that kind of environment, right? There's been a lot of research. There's been a lot of research that has shown that when somebody really studies in a similar setting. It helps with recall. Develop a pre-test routine. Use the same routine, right? In terms of what you eat, what you do, what you say, your mantra that you use. This one seems obvious, but I don't think most students really know how big of a difference it makes when you exercise and eat right. It really does. Eliminate the self-talk, especially during the exam. Eliminate all that negative talk, replace it with positive talk, and really learn some relaxation and focusing techniques. They really help during the exam. Okay, so thanks for listening to some of these general tips that I'm giving you, general advice that I'm giving you. We're now going to move into part number 1, or task 1 of the speaking section, and you're going to really get some really great advice. I'm going to give you some really good examples of part 1 questions. So let's move forward, and I'll talk to you soon.